You might remember a show on television from when we were younger called Reading Rainbow. And one of the things I remember from that show was they would have kids get up and share about a story that they had read. And they would do that so that the audience could listen and maybe get interested in reading the book for themselves. Well, that's what I'd like to do today. I'd like to talk to you about a book that I just recently reread, and it is a Christian classic, still good for today. It's called Basic Christianity by John Stott. What I'd like to do today is basically give you some background about the book Basic Christianity, tell you a little bit about the author, give an overview of the outline of the book itself, and then talk about some possible uses of the book. So beginning with the author, the man who wrote this is named John Stott. He was an Anglican minister throughout the 1900s and actually passed away about 2011. Stott was the rector emeritus of All Souls Church in London. He was listed as one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine in 2005. And he was a very evangelistic biblical teacher as well as a prolific and very good writer. He also wrote a book that I would consider his magnum opus, and another book worth looking into, The Cross of Christ, where he looks at the history and the meaning of the cross and does a fantastic job giving a lot of information. Let's just give a little bit of background about the book Basic Christianity. It was first published in 1958 based on a series of lectures that were first given at Cambridge University. And these were given in 1952. And then Stott went on to give these talks at various universities throughout the world. And I believe that he went to about 50 different events giving these lectures. These lectures became the foundation of the book Basic Christianity. This now is a 60-year-old book. I have a copy of the 2008 50th anniversary edition, and even back then it had sold over 2.5 million copies. So needless to say, it really is a Christian classic. You can get the book very affordably on Amazon for about $6. And you say, well, you know, it's kind of an older book. Aren't there newer Christian books that would be worth reading? Well, here's the thing. A lot of new Christian books are worth reading. However, there are a lot of things that we emphasize today and that we talk about today that are really good, but sometimes at the expense of things that we don't talk about as much anymore. And an author like John Stott was writing the mid-1900s when he first put this together. And so even though in some ways the book is making some assumptions and coming from a place that's a little bit different than where we're coming from today, he does a good job emphasizing certain things that we might tend to overlook. So I would say even though it's an older book, it's actually because it's an older book that you might want to take some time to read through this. This book seeks to communicate the central message of Christianity in a clear and concise manner. So when you walk away from this book, you'll understand the basics of Christianity. It'll really help you to understand what it means to be a Christian. You might think you know what a Christian is or all that that entails, but this book will really help you to understand what it means according to Jesus himself and the writers of the Bible. Let me give you a basic outline of this book. The book is broken down into 4 parts. But before we get to any of the 4 major parts of the book, there's an introductory chapter called The Right Approach. And this is where Stott talks about how before we can even delve into the Christian message, we have to approach it the right way. We have to see that God has been speaking and acting throughout history, and primarily, most importantly, He's done that in the person of Jesus. And before we can really understand the message of Christianity, we have to really come to a place of being open and seeking the truth. So that's what the right approach lays as a foundation before he gets into the 4 major parts of the book. The first major part of the book is who Christ is. It talks about the claims that Jesus made about himself, as well as the character of who Jesus was and how he lived his life. So that just gets us to look at the biblical data and what the eyewitnesses and what Jesus said about himself. Then he gets into the resurrection of Christ, where it gets to the real central aspect of the Christian teaching of Jesus dying and rising again. The second part of the book then goes into what we need today. There are a couple of chapters here that talk about why what Jesus did is so important for us now. One chapter is on the fact and nature of sin, and another chapter is on the consequences of sin. Now, sin, again, is not something that you hear a lot about today, especially in non-religious circles. But even in Christian circles, it can be downplayed a lot. And yet, he really does a good job of showing what does Jesus have to say about that? What does the Bible really say about sin? And what does that look like in our lives today? Part 3 talks about what Jesus has done in order to save us. And this part of the book talks clearly about the death of Jesus on the cross, his resurrection, and then the salvation that Jesus provides for people today. Part 4 then gets us how to respond to what Jesus has done for us. And so he, in this part of the book, talks about counting the cost, because that's something Jesus talked about. If you're going to be my disciple, Jesus says, you have to count the cost. And Jesus says, in a way, it is a very heavy cost. You have to set everything aside and say, I'm willing to trust you, Jesus, with my life. So this part of the book does a good job of showing how we count the cost and then how we have to make a decision. Ultimately, this is something we all have to take a look at. What is the decision that I have made about Jesus? It's possible that you've made a decision against him and you're saying, oh, I don't really care about that and I don't believe. You might be someone who says, well, I'm just not sure. I don't really know why it's that important. Or you might be someone who says, yes, absolutely, I have made a decision for Jesus Christ. The point is, we all have to make a decision, and it's a very important decision. A real key point that Stott makes in this book is that you're not born a Christian. A lot of people think that you can just be born as a Christian. And if you're out there and that's what you think, you definitely should read this book. But the correction he's making is that what you're born as is just a human. And you're born in sinfulness and with all the struggles that we all face. What we need actually, according to Jesus, is to be born again. And so Stott is explaining what that means and how we can know that we've been born again, as Jesus talked about, or born from above, spiritually reborn, in order to have that new life that only comes through Jesus. So the question is, what decision have we made about Jesus? And have we even taken the time to really look at who he is and what the central message of Christianity is? So this book really helps us to do that. In light of all that, I'd like to just close off with some great uses potentially for this book. Number one would be to help you to understand the gospel better. You might say, well, I have a Christian background, or I am a Christian, so why would I even want to read this book if it's called Basic Christianity? Well, the truth is, I read it and I found it to be very refreshing and encouraging because it reminds me of the basics. It reminds me of the foundational things that allow me to know what I am as a Christian. And I think that's a really valid thing to go back and do. Number two, it will help you to explain the gospel better to other people. Let's face it, it can be hard sometimes to explain the Christian faith, and people have a lot of misunderstandings. Well, Stott has taken the time to really lay out a lot of things and even deal with certain kinds of objections that people might have to lay the historical and the biblical groundwork for the gospel message so that people can really understand it clearly. A third use of the book is to give it to someone that you are reaching out to, and you can tell God's working in their life, and you've been sharing your faith with them, but you don't really know maybe exactly what to do next, and maybe God would show you this would be a good book to give to that person to help them in their spiritual journey. Fourthly, you might want to give this book to a new believer. Maybe you are a new believer out there and you're just like, I need something to help me understand Christianity better. Or maybe you're a pastor or another church teacher or leader who says, I want to have a book that I can give to new believers in my church or give it at a new believers class. This would be a great little textbook for that kind of a situation. Well, I hope that I've whetted your appetite a little bit for the subject matter of this book. That's my basic background of the book, and in the coming videos I'm going to get into the details of what John Stott says in the book basic Christianity. But that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching.